Now, after yesterday's glimmer of hope, Israeli security officials have said more hostages could be released today, perhaps up to 14, during a temporary truce between Israel and Hamas. Well, this comes as the first 24 hostages were set free yesterday in exchange for Palestinian prisoners, including women and children, who in the past hour, Israel have said they're preparing to release 42 of in the second phase of the hostage deal. Benjamin Netanyahu's office have said they are reviewing a list of captives that could be freed over the next 24 hours in return for the safe release of more hostages. Well, joining me now is Israeli diplomat Alon Pinkas. Very good morning to you, Alon. I wanted to ask you first about those 13 Israeli hostages that were released yesterday. We've seen pictures and moving images of them this morning. What do we know about their condition, mentally and physically, after 7 weeks in captivity?
Well, good morning, Ali. I don't know about the mental state. I can only imagine that they've been traumatized. And as psychologists, unlike me, would tell you, that takes time to ascertain, and that takes time to diagnose the levels of trauma and you know, the residual experiences. Physically, my understanding is that they are all okay. There have been some elderly women who required medication, but that's the extent of what I know about this batch, at least. We are expecting the release of an additional 13 throughout Saturday, that is.
Yes, we are expecting a further, we hope, 14 today, all being well. I wanted to ask you, of course, this is part of a deal, those hostages for Palestinian prisoners. What do we know about those women and children who've been released from Palestinian jails? What were they being held for? What were they convicted of? And there were some there that were still awaiting trial, weren't they?
Yeah, well, correct. Some have been awaiting, some have been charged and not tried yet, certainly not convicted. They were mostly, by and large, they are accused of being part of terror cells, incitement, arms smuggling, participation in terror attacks, and so on and so forth. These are not, at this point at least, these are not big-time terrorists that have been released.
And when you see these prisoners being released, of course, it's a very delicate situation. Israel's focus is the safe return of those hostages. But in the sense of the principle of negotiating with terrorists, Western governments have opposed that for a very, very long time. But do you feel as though a deal has been done here with terrorists? And do you fear about that creation of more problems down the line?
Well, you know, we've always maintained that we will never negotiate with terrorists. And at the same time, we've always negotiated with terrorists. So this is not the first time. So by no means, Ali, is this a precedent. Not only that, but I expect further deals. Well, forget me, President Biden, speaking last night at a press conference, has said he expects further deals in the upcoming days. So these deals, whether they're mediated by Qatar or mediated by the U.S. or a combination thereof, the Red Cross, the UN, Qatar, the U.S., et cetera, we are effectively negotiating with terrorists. So I would dispense with this very lofty principle of we'll never negotiate with terrorists. We are, in fact, negotiating with terrorists.
And we're talking about 50 hostages being released in this 4-day temporary ceasefire. But that does leave a further 190, around that figure, left inside Gaza. Of course, a very, very delicate situation. How do you think those 190 people remaining inside Gaza, how do you think they will eventually be released? Will we see a series of these temporary ceasefires?
Well, exactly. You just hit the nail. A series of ceasefires. Let's take what President Biden said last night in Nantucket during his Thanksgiving vacation. He said that he expects dozens to be free, dozens of hostages, that is, to be freed in the next couple of days. Now, in the next few days. Now, that insinuates that there are further negotiations going on. These negotiations cannot be completed, cannot be conducted, certainly not completed, without further ceasefires. So we're, as you just precisely noted, we're looking at a series of ceasefires that in between could have local flare-ups in Gaza, but certainly not the resumption of the war the way we saw it in the last few days. So I think the Americans are politely and elegantly changing the contours of the conflict. No longer the war that we saw and we were accustomed to until a few days ago, but rather a successive series of ceasefires. Now, as for your first point about the other hostages, we need to divide them, Ali, into two groups. The civilians, non-combatants, which I think will be part of that ongoing series of exchanges. But then there are the soldiers. There are several dozens of soldiers who've been taken hostage, and I think Hamas, I know for a fact that Hamas will keep them as a very last asset to negotiate. There could come a point where Israel will be reluctant to pay the price that Hamas will be asking probably, i.e. the release of thousands. And some of these soldiers may have to be extracted via military operations, which are obviously risky for both those coming out to rescue them and for those being held hostage. So we're looking at a very volatile situation in the next few weeks.
A volatile situation indeed. Alon Pinkas, really good to have you on the programme this morning. Thank you so much for your analysis on what is a very, very delicate situation. Thank you very much indeed.